All guests on Keel heard via the Jack Spring Electric Keel Newsmaker hotline. The latest of those this morning. Fox sportscaster, my goodness, what a resume. Speaking of resumes, Mr. Tim Brando is here, Shreveport, Bossier City guy. Hey, Mr. Tim, welcome back to Keel. How you doing this morning?
I'm fine, Robert J. And Aaron, it's good to be with both of you. And, obviously, I wish it were for a different reason, but nice to chat with you and reminisce a little bit about a true legend.
Let me start with, your Twitter page, and I'm going to read it, and then I want you to expound on it as much as you would like. You tweeted, guys like Griffin were everywhere, but not as versatile. My dad told me when I was a kid, this guy Griffin can do anything on TV. You just ask him and he'll do it. The weather, the news if needed. In those days, you could find Bob at Mirror's Steakhouse, later Don's, loving life. Tell us, start there and just take off, because I know you can.
Well, listen, a lot of the younger broadcasters out there today, many of whom maybe worked with Bob in recent years, kind of knew him as jolly old Bob talking about the good life and getting a group of retired people together to go on long trips, and he was, and that's what he did in the later stages of his life. But his impact and his influence was far more reaching than just being a sportscaster. I mean, he was a broadcaster in every sense of the word. In the pioneering days of television, TV was a new medium when he came to town in the late 50s and early 60s. I knew him as a baby. I was only about 4 or 5 years old when I met him for the first time. He was a contemporary, really, of my dad's, who helped put KSLA on the air as the first television station in the late 50s, at a time when there was an ownership squabble between two different groups, and my dad represented one of those groups at that time. Winston Lanham represented the other, and the FCC basically made the two groups operate the station as a whole. In other words, there were two different ownership groups running the operation, and there was no real network TV back in those days. It was not a thing yet, and what networks did provide was very little. And so local programming was everything in those days. That's one of the reasons why my father had all of the shows that he had, and it was one of the reasons why people that were incredibly talented and willing to do a lot of different things were going to be hired in TV. You know, there was no videotape back in those days, so all the commercials had to be done live. And that took a lot of extemporaneous talent, and Bob had it. And whether it was local, people that remember him doing the sports, yes, but he also did from time to time the weather. If the news guy got sick, he would do that. He did a show called Bob and His Buddies, and I think a lot of folks my age and maybe a little bit older are going to remember first and foremost. But he did a lot more than that, and a willingness to just try anything was something that not many people in those days had, and he was one of those guys. And my father knew I wanted to be a broadcaster, so he would share these things with me. And then later on, as a teenager, knowing that I was going to be a broadcaster and becoming one, maybe sooner than most people would, I was in Bob's world when he was in his prime. In the 70s, Bob Griffin was the man about town, not just in sports, but as a personality. And you know, he really wasn't as big into sports as most sportscasters would be. But I think that's one of the reasons why Bob was so revered, because he had many interests, and those many interests people understood. Sports became the vehicle for his platform, but his platform was much larger than that.
Tim, let me ask you something about Bob, because I always felt it when I was around him. I know a lot of people say the same thing. He always made you feel like you were the most special person in the room. That's a quality. That's a rare quality. Was that something Bob has had, you probably think, all his life?
Yeah, Aaron, but he went through a big transformation in the time that I was away from Shreveport and when I came back. I left in 78, came back in 90. In terms of living, I would come in and visit from time to time. But he went through a major transformation during that period in his life. He was always an enjoyable guy to be around, but his persona was much different in his younger days. As I said, when I mentioned Mary Steakhouse, there was a bandstand there, and my dad's band used to play there on a regular basis. And Bob could be found at all of the night spots back in those days. He was a bachelor, and he was very well known, and people wanted to be around him. He was a magnet in a lot of ways. If he walked into the room, it was all eyes on him. But you're right. He made that transformation, and for him, it was all eyes on you, and it was about helping others. And that sort of personal transformation that he made to go along with the just genuine personality that everyone loved already made him even more captivating. And I think that's his greatest legacy is what he did for others. You know, I never worked with or for Bob. So many others in your midst, like Tony Tagliavore, Daryl Reboucher. These guys got their first jobs with Bob, and you know, I know they're hurting today because he meant so much to them and their early days as broadcasters. And there are many, many others, by the way, that fall into that category. But I remember him as a larger-than-life personality that was capable of being so genuine with others and making others feel really good. And even in my career hiccup period, leaving CBS and going to Fox, he didn't have my number. I know I didn't have his. He called somebody and got my number to call me, to give me an attaboy and to just say, hey, you know, I know that I know you don't know where you're going to be yet, but listen, you're a pro's pro, and you'll be back at it. I didn't know where I was going to wind up, and I wound up at Fox, and it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Bob wanted everybody from Shreveport that was in the national limelight to be successful, whether it was athletes or broadcasters or singers or dancers or whoever came from our area. He was so proud of Shreveport, so proud of anyone that came from Shreveport, and wanted to just revel in their success. And again, you're right. He made everyone in his midst believe that they were the story, not himself.